What was happening was that Asia was slowly coming back from a century and a half of European imperial rule. But that was beneath the surface. It was gradual. It was year to year. And it looked like the United States and the Soviet Union were duking it out so that when the Soviet Union ended in December 1991, there was one superpower remaining. The end of history was declared. The United States looked like the sole superpower. It was the unipolar moment. U.S. was the indispensable country. Every superlative one could imagine was given. The neoconservatives in the United States believed their own headlines, and the portrayal that the fundamental change in the world was U.S. dominance became the meme. But I would say from an economic point of view, the fundamental story was the year by year, step by step narrowing of the gap between the West, again, meaning Europe and the US, and Asia. And the rise of Asia was the real story in terms of relative power. Now, one could add a few points that even in the heyday of U.S. power, the U.S. could not defeat Vietnam. The U.S. could not overcome the anti-colonial wars and anti-colonial sentiments. The U.S. could not keep European empires intact or replace them with American empires in much of Asia, though the U.S. influence in post-war Japan and Korea was nearly total, we can say. But all of this means that, from my point of view, the unipolar moment after 1991 was an illusion to an important extent. If you were looking at this as an economist, as I was during that period, I was rather routinely saying that Asia is rising and that this is creating a different kind of world. If you were in geopolitics, power projection, and military, it didn't necessarily look like that. And what's interesting, I think, and I think it would be fun to actually go back to look at what the strategists were saying about China back in 1991 and 1992 when the unipolar moment was projected. My memory, which may be wrong, is that they weren't saying much about China, that China was not viewed as a likely important actor. It was a poor country that assembled goods for U.S. markets. It would be good if it rose in power, perhaps, because it would continue to check Russian influence. But I don't think that China was viewed as a strategic issue by the United States until after the start of the 21st century, and really until around 2010 when Obama started talking famously about the Asia pivot or the China pivot. So all of this is to say, Glenn, that the broadest trend of all in the world scene, in my view, is that from 1800 to 1950, roughly speaking, the Western world, led by the European empires and within Europe by Britain, dominated the world. They industrialized. They had the vast preponderance of military power. They had the vast preponderance of technology, the overwhelming leadership in science. Whether that balance was in Europe or the United States already began to shift by the beginning of the 20th century, but decisively shifted at the end of World War II. But taking the West as a whole, that dominance of the West peaked around 1950. And while there was well, I'd say the headline was European empires over, India independent, People's Republic of China uh, declared, and so forth. Um, those political headlines started a deep economic process that we loosely call catching up. It's not an adequate phrase, but at least for the first 50 years of the period from 1950 to 2000, it's not a bad phrase to think that what was happening in Asia was catching up in the sense of literacy for the first time, mass public education for the first time, basic infrastructure being built that had not really been built during the European imperial heyday. Catching up no longer is the right phrase because China's clearly in the lead technologically in a lot of areas now, and the United States is by far not the hegemon or the sole superpower in the world on most criteria, economically and technologically. China is at least the peer of the United States, but I would say in manufacturing almost across the board, and in heavy industry almost across the board, China's way ahead of the United States right now. So in this sense, the idea that American hegemony is coming to an end, I would say that has been true gradually for decades. Uh, I would say that the uh, post-1991 euphoria in the United States about the unipolar world, and it really was euphoria. I was around to see it in the think tanks, to see it in the universities, to see it in Washington, to, of course, listen to it in the rhetoric of every president and so forth. This was always, in my view, economically ignorant. I was also part of a debate back in the 1990s. Was the rise of Asia real or something that was going to collapse? And there were articles about the myth of the Asian miracle and so forth. And my view all along was we're seeing a long-term, real catching up process. And again, after 2010, a going ahead process in many ways. So I never bought into this unipolar story as being real. And having witnessed the Vietnam War debacle, I always felt that America exaggerated its power. I would say that the Ukraine war is another demonstration of the clear limits of American unipolarity, because basically uh, the Ukraine war was the end of NATO enlargement and the end of the U.S. putting its pieces on the board wherever it wanted. We can remember that in this unipolar moment, Zbigniew Brzezinski basically had the idea that the United States would come to dominate Eurasia, nothing less, and that Ukraine would be the pivot for doing that. And President Putin basically stood up and said, no, not on my watch. It's not going to happen. And the Ukraine war is essentially a war of the limits of American expansion. So the limits were already demonstrated. The U.S. thought that it would just blow off Russia financially, economically, by sanctions, or militarily, or through subversion inside with some kind of color revolution or something else. And all of that proved to be a complete illusion as well. So, long answer to the question. Yes, we're seeing the limits of Western power. We're seeing the limits of U.S. power. But my answer is that Western power, which is a relative concept after all, has been waning because of the rise of Asia already since 75 years, since the middle of the 20th century. and the unipolar moment was never real. It was always a bit delusional to think that the U.S. Was riding supreme. Now, having said all of that, the U.S. clearly still has a lot of power and a lot of influence and a lot of destructive capacity. So this isn't the collapse of U.S. power, but it is definitely the limits of U.S. power.